welcome to the April meeting of the Regional Transportation Advisory Council. And we have enough time. It's not gonna, we don't have a long agenda today, so and there are few enough people here, so we can do a round of introductions. If you want to say a little more about yourself this time, that's fine. Of course, you don't have to. So I'll just call on people, starting with John McQueen.
I'm sorry.
Yeah, I'm sorry. You have to do
Matt, you have
sorry.
to.
Yeah, I apologize. Just protocol. I don't mean to interrupt.
No need to apologize. I forget this.
So, welcome everybody. Just gonna run through the guidelines here. All participants will join the meeting with muted microphones. If you could please rename yourself to include your first name, last name, and your affiliation, should you have one, that would be great. To participate in the discussion, you can select the raise hand function, and you can find this in a couple of different places depending on the version of Zoom that you have. You can find this under the reactions button at the bottom of your, or the toolbar at the bottom of your screen. It may be directly on the toolbar at the bottom of your screen. And if you don't see the raise hand button in either of those places, then click on the participants window and that will open, and there should be a raise hand button there. And if you're on the phone, you can use *9 to raise your hand and *6 to mute and unmute yourself. And if you have any technical difficulties, feel free to contact me, Matt Archer, via the chat box at marcher@ctps.org or at 857-702-3708. I'm just going to read the accessibility statement. This meeting is accessible to people with disabilities. Zoom products are compliant with exceptions with the following standards: Web Content Accessibility Guidelines 2.1 Level AA standards and revised Section 508 standards. If you require any additional accommodations in order to fully participate in this meeting, please contact me, Matt Archer, at marcher@ctps.org via the chat box or at 857-702-3708. And with that, I will toss it back to you, Len.
Thank you, Matt. Appreciate it. So we'll get started with the introductions, and I will start with John McQueen.
John McQueen, Walk Boston.
And John Strauss.
Hi, Len. John Strauss, Burlington.
Thank you, John. Owen McDonald.
USA.
John McDonald. Oh, I'm sorry, Owen McDonald.
Owen McDonald, Town of Weymouth.
Thank you, Owen. John Seward.
John Seward, Move Mass.
Yeah. Thank you, John. And Anna Christina Fragosa.
Anna Christina is having a volume issue at the moment, or an audio issue rather. So maybe we can come back to her.
All right. David Montgomery.
David Montgomery, Town of Needham.
Thank you, David. Franny Osmond.
Yep, Franny Osmond, Town of Acton.
Thank you, Franny. Katie Malkin.
Hi, Katie Malkin via Transportation. And I had thought that I had seen on the agenda that you all would be covering the Community Connections Program, but I think that I got that wrong.
It's part of it because of the tip.
Yeah, it's part of the tip, but no, we're not talking about them specifically, but it is part of the tip, and we do have some good news about it, so.
Great.
So
I'll hang on to listen then.
Yeah, and it's also recorded, and so I don't want to oversell it, but thanks for joining us,
Thank you.
via transportation.
Yeah, we have a partner who was who had applied for one of the Community Connections grants, so I was kind of just curious to listen in.
Oh yeah, yeah, okay.
If you would put your contact information in the chat. Oh, you can't put it in the chat, but if you can give it to somebody to put in the chat, it would be great. Because here in Acton, we're sort of watching very carefully what you're doing with Newton and some other places. So
great, I will find a way to add it, and I'll write your name down too. Maybe I'll just contact you.
So you do the micro transit in Newton?
Yes,
right.
Yeah,
Okay.
We do, and they had recently applied for an EV to kind of convert their fleet to EVs.
Cool.
So, yeah.
Oh, yeah, I'm impressed. If I remember that. I could go on, but maybe
I'll
later.
let you go. Thank you.
And let's see, the chat window just popped over my participants window. Let's see, Derek Cravat.
Yep.
Hi, everybody. Derek Cravat, MassDOT Office of Transportation Planning.
Great, thank you, Derek. And Fred Mosley.
Yeah, Fred Mosley with ACEC.
Thank you, Fred. Jennifer Rowe.
Jen Rowe, City of Boston.
Thank you, Jen. Scarlett Larrabee.
Boston Society of Architects.
Thank you, Skylar. And I think that's it. Let me just scroll back up. If I missed anyone, just chime in now or raise your hand. Okay, and so I'm Len Dickinson, and I am with the MBTA Right Oversight Committee, chair of Advisory Board, Advisory Council. And both. And Matt, so actually, you know what? I mean, we'll let Matt introduce himself as when he comes before us to talk about the TIP draft program scenario for fiscal years 23 to 27. And so, Matt, it's all yours.
Hey, thanks, Len, and good afternoon, everyone. Matt Genova with the Boston Region MPO. I manage the MPO's Transportation Improvement Program, or TIP process. So we have my understanding of this agenda item is that it's a fairly open-ended conversation to sort of give you all an update on where things stand with the TIP. And then obviously, have plenty of time to sort of let you all ask questions, talk through things. So I don't have a ton to go over. Like I don't have a formal slide deck today. But I guess I think sent out as a part of the pre-meeting materials was an updated version of the sort of very large and detailed scenario table that you've probably seen a number of times. So we did update that with the MPO's decisions from the last MPO meeting on March 31st, which as many of you probably know is when the MPO made draft funding decisions for the fiscal years 23 through 27 TIP. And so, I'm happy to talk through sort of the high points of what's in there and then maybe just open it up for a dialogue. My goal today is really just to be a resource for you all as you think through some of the decisions that are made in the TIP. So Len, I'll defer to you if there are certain things you'd like me to touch on. Otherwise I can give a couple minute overview and we can go from there.
Sure, just the overview would go from there, Matt, thanks.
Awesome. Yeah, so let's see. Would it be, I could share my screen. I don't know how well you'll be able to see it. So it might actually be better if folks just have that summary table that was sent out pulled up, on your own screens, because then you can sort of zoom in and work with it. But I will just sort of talk through the high points. So, the basic situation for this year, which again, many of you are probably familiar with, is that the MPO did have access to a lot of new funding through the still recently passed bipartisan infrastructure law. It's the new federal infrastructure bill that was passed and signed into law back on November 15th of 2021. And so that law sort of replaces the FAST Act and is now our 5-year governing legislation for the TIP process. And so that is the legislation that sets how much money that we have to spend every year. And so the upshot of all those numbers is that the MPO had about $20 million a year in new funding available beginning in fiscal year 2022, which is the current fiscal year, and running all the way through, we anticipate all the way through 2027 for the purposes of this TIP. And so the new roughly $20 million a year plus, just always adding that 5th and final year of TIP funding gave the MPO more than $230 million of funding flexibility this year to allocate to new projects. And so the MPO's big task from the last board meeting on March 31st is really to figure out what to do with all that, to be productive with those funds. But obviously, a big part of the challenge is finding projects that are ready to take some of those earlier year funds in 2022 and 2023. And one other sort of layer to this is that the MPO learned in recent weeks that the final year of funding that we had allocated to the Green Line Extension project was actually no longer needed to close out the project. And so we got about $27 million back in 2022, which is very exciting and great that that project is coming in under budget, albeit a little bit behind schedule, but that's okay. Hopefully folks have been able to ride the Union Square branch, you know, in the last month or so. But yeah, so that was sort of the foundation, is that we had a lot of money to spend, and we're trying to figure out, you know, the sort of highest and best use of those funds in any given year. And so I'll just touch on some of the main takeaways from the decisions that were made. And if you do have the table pulled up, you'll see, as you scroll down to the third page, you'll see some projects and funding amounts that are highlighted in gold. And those are the projects that were actually discussed in the MPO meeting itself on March 31st, and that were added to the tip over and above what was already sort of included by staff in that sort of like baseline scenario to start the meeting. So the big picture takeaway is that everything highlighted on that third page in gold, plus all the things highlighted in blue, were funded by the MPO. And then there's a darker shade of blue, and those two projects have been proposed for funding by MassDOT. And so you'll see that the MPO funded a vast majority of the projects that it scored for funding this year, including, very excitingly, all of the Community Connections Program projects were funded. And then from there, you know, these projects, some of these projects in gold were also added to use up some of that early year funding. And so those projects notably are 2 MBTA projects, one on rehabbing the Lynn commuter rail station, another one making accessibility improvements to the Forest Hills station. So those 2 projects got a significant amount of funding in 2022 and 23. And then 2 other bridge projects that were put forward by MassDOT for consideration, but that have a lot of, certainly a lot of like bicycle and pedestrian and hopefully transit elements as well, were also funded. And that is the Route 30 bridge between Newton and Weston, which will also include a significant bicycle and pedestrian connection between Route 30 projects that are ongoing on, you know, both the east and west side of that bridge in Newton and in Weston. And then another bridge project in the Sullivan Square area in Boston and sort of right at the edge of Somerville, which will make significant improvements to 2 bridges that feed into Sullivan Square. And the hope is to have, you know, a significantly better bicycle and pedestrian and potentially transit accommodations there as well. There's a lot of information, but I'll sort of stop there and take any questions. And, you know, we can sort of just talk through details as folks would like to.
I did just want to say very quickly, if folks would like, I can share the scenario. As Matt noted, it's pretty detailed, so it will probably involve a lot of zooming in and out, going to specific areas. But if folks would find that useful, I'm more than happy to screen share that.
So we have John McDonald.
Yeah, hi.
I'm sorry, McQueen. Sorry, McQueen. Sorry.
Yeah, that's okay. I'm new.
Yeah, right.
Thanks, Matt. Thanks. And I noticed that a lot of the changes that we asked for, you know, in terms of emphasizing the community connections and things like that for moving up the ladder happened. In terms of moving other things forward, there are a number on the first page, let's say, and I think some on the second page, that are high risk and designated as high risk, and essentially the Littleton Air and the Peabody and I guess Watertown. How high a risk really are they? Because I know that some of the other projects that are now on approved on the tip fully had been maybe a little high risk a couple months ago. And I noticed that Littleton had its 100% submitted maybe, you know, a month ago. What can be done, or how high a risk is it for them in terms of being really included, and what could be done to help accelerate them from an official, let's say, an internal standpoint from, let's say, MassDOT or CTPS?
Yeah, it's a good question. So those high risk flags were sort of placed on these projects by MassDOT back in like early February. And so part of the reason to like sort of continue to flag them as high risk is one, to just reflect, that they are a little bit tight on time, but also
Right.
to sort of continue to keep the pressure on to make sure that those projects are moving forward. And so the good news that, some Littleton and Air is a perfect example of a project that, has made some progress, over the last couple of months since that initial flag was placed. As you noted, they submitted their 100% designs in late February. And so, at this stage, those risk flags are still there, just to say that, they're not sort of in the clear, but at this stage, the projects are also all anticipated to be able to, advertise for construction bids in their current fiscal year. And so, so really the risk flag is a way of just sort of making sure that everyone's aware that, there are some questions about schedule, but that, really they just need a little bit of sort of extra care and attention. At this stage, and for a project like Littleton and Air, like MassDOT is leading design on that project. And so
Right.
it's really mostly a flag for them to make sure that all MassDOT stakeholders are on the same page about the need to move that forward. And obviously that work is happening given the design submission.
Okay, so it's as much pressure for the municipality to be moving forward to their milestones, as well as internally to get the approvals, let's say, if they're 100% going or, on time and not delayed.
Yeah, I mean, it just depends on sort of who the project proponent is.
Okay.
And so for those other projects like PBD and Watertown that you flagged,
Right.
those are the municipalities in those cases are the project proponents. And so these flags are really a way to identify to them that, hey, we're concerned about your project. We want to make sure that it stays on track. So like, please,
Don't go to sleep.
Keep things moving forward. And and so part of this whole, TIP development process every spring is that, once MassDOT makes those identifications in February, then we as MPO staff reach out to municipalities and say like, hey, we just want to check in, see how things are going. Do you need support? Are there like barriers to, moving the project forward? And so it's a way to just keep the conversation going.
Okay, great. Thanks.
Anna Christina?
Oh, can you hear me okay?
Sure can.
Okay, sorry about the earlier, my sound wasn't working. I don't know if I misunderstood or if I came in too late. You said that the projects in gold that you discussed in March, those are the ones, though you said there was a surplus of 27 million, but these are all, this is like 47 million, 35 million, 20 million. So those are not going to get paid with the surplus, or why were they discussing these particular projects?
Yeah, so the $27 million surplus was just the surplus that originated from getting our Green Line extension funding back in 2022. But there were also other sources of surplus, namely the bipartisan infrastructure law funding, which was about $20 million in each fiscal year. And then there was yet another source, which is that, a handful of projects did have to be delayed a little bit. And then, the earlier years for those projects were originally scheduled, then had some extra funding come available. And so all of those sources of surplus layered on top of each other, which is where we get these large gaps.
And these were chosen specifically because they're closest to being ready to go into the next phase of construction?
Yeah, they were identified by MassDOT as, projects that are or can be ready, on their existing timelines, in the fiscal years that they were funded. And they're also in line with MPO priorities about, sort of key regional connections, especially again in the bicycle and pedestrian network. Both of these two bridge projects have significant bicycle and pedestrian improvements, and clearly are at sort of critical, on critical roadways within the region that are really more, regional connections, not just local connections. And so I think for some of those reasons, MassDOT put those forward as saying like, hey, these are certainly priorities, like the bridges are in need of rehab, conditions are not great today. And they align with some of the MPO standing priorities around funding projects and can be ready on the right timeline. And so, they were part of the mix of what the MPO could consider, again, alongside some of the MBTA station projects as well that were funded.
Okay, thanks.
Franny?
I'd love to know, because we're so interested in microtransit around here, what the conversations about the microtransit applications were like.
Yeah, it's a good question. My sort of sense of this, and Len, feel free to add from your perspective. But my sort of sense of this is that we're still relatively early in the Community Connections program, just sort of as a funding source and as an approach to funding projects for the MPO. We do have two microtransit or sort of one shuttle, one microtransit project that have been funded by the MPO to date through the Community Connections program. And so because we don't have a huge, what I want to call it, sort of like stable of projects to look at and say like, these types of projects have been successful, these other ones have been less successful, what have you. I think right now we're sort of at the stage where we do have a lot of extra funding available to the MPO right now. And we have, a reasonable number of projects that are sort of scattered throughout the region. Some are municipally led, some are led by RTAs. And so I think there's a little bit of a sense of like, let's try some of these out and sort of build up this base of shuttle and microtransit projects that the MPO has funded to really begin to assess like what's working well, what doesn't. I think from there we can sort of refine in future years how to approach funding more of these projects. But Len, feel free to add to this. But that's sort of my sense, is that I think the conversation was pretty open-minded, just saying like, if we have the funding available and we have projects that are all like, reasonably well scoring and seem like they're fitting a good need, then, let's sort of give them the chance to prove themselves and then see how it goes.
Yeah, I agree. And a little more of the conversation, I think, although not verbalized, if you look at the scores that were given to the projects, you get a sense of how we can even think about them in comparison to each other, and certainly with respect to our overall objectives. And combine this discussion with the MPO's discussion, the divorce discussion, with our 3C conversation, where we asked that the board consider, especially for the community collection projects, to take everything that was high score but low cost. Actually, I think we applied that to everything, but that would pretty much grab most, if not all, of the community connections projects. And as I said, that was part of the overall conversation for the 3C committee. It wasn't specifically focused on the microtransit projects, but it would grab those. Another thing, to factor into consideration about the conversation is the community connections. The transit working group. There was one meeting with them where it actually talked about some of the microtransit projects. And Newton in specific came up, and that was, I think, if you make it a more robust program, then you increase the utilization of it, which potentially makes it a more successful project. Because a lot of times these projects don't succeed because you start up, people use it for a little while, and then the usage goes down. And I think in Newton, they found that if they increase the coverage, and I think even increase the frequency at which people could get, or which the services were available, they found that utility went up, or utilization went up, which made it, at least by that metric, a successful project. So I'm trying not to say things that are more hopeful on my part than what actually has taken place. But I'm hoping that we can fund these projects outside of community connections, because I like to think of community connections almost as a testing ground and if we can show that there is some decent potential there, that we could maybe fund them through the broader set of MPO funds. And I know that there are limitations on what we can do with MPO funds. So that's one of the reasons I hesitate to say that that is something that we will do. But as I said, it's more wishful thinking on my part. But maybe also wishful thinking on my part is the fact that when we grabbed a MassDOT project, the $47 million one for the superstructure in Somerville. And I think that's a really good multimodal project. But that's now money that MassDOT doesn't have to spend at some other point in time. And so I would like to think that if MassDOT's constraints on its funds are less than they are for the MPO, that given our priority for the community connections, that maybe they could pick up some of those at some point in time. And I'll also add, I don't see it on the table here, but I don't think there's place for it on the table, but community connections funding was increased by $500,000, went from 2 to 2.5, and MP transit modernization went up by $500,000. I don't remember what the base number was, and that's permanent, as far as I know. So that's not simply a one-year boost. That's across the entire range of the tip. So I'll stop there. Toss it back over to Matt. Or if someone wants me to clarify what I said, I'll be happy to do that. At least try. So Matt, you're nodding your head.
Yeah, no, I just wanted to amplify sort of a couple of points that you made. Your last point about the increases in funding for both community connections and transit modernization, like the program lines, is a really great one. I'm sorry, I forgot to mention that, but yeah, that is envisioned as, for all intents and purposes, a permanent increase in funding, just recognizing that our overall funding level has gone up, and both of those programs are intended to be a percentage of the MPO's overall funding, 2% for community connections and 5% for transit modernization. And so, the exact dollar amounts that we were using before were just sort of a good round number that is near those percentages. But since our overall funding went up by about $20 million a year, then, the thinking was those program line items should also go up accordingly. And so that, that definitely opens up a little bit more flexibility to fund more of both those types of projects in the future. And then just the other point I wanted to amplify that Len touched on, which is that 4 of the 6 transit operating projects that the MPO selected through the Community Connections program this year are expansions of existing services, which I think, obviously, again, to Len's point, right, the hope is that because the service is already out there on the ground, having some MPO funding to help that service grow, will just serve to create a more sustainable and well-used service in the long run. And so I think, that's like a nice way for the MPO to use its funds to say, like, we already recognize that there's a commitment to these services that either municipalities or RTAs are making, and we can use some of our resources to help support that work.
So John McQueen?
Yeah, a couple of things. To your point of adding coverage and levels of service, I think that's perfectly true, and it helps to just validate, I guess, the general maxims or assumptions we make for the MBTA in terms of its viability and its usefulness and its ridership levels. I mean, you add coverage and you add levels of service, and ridership tends to go up, if you have neutral fares, let's say. And I guess overall, the microtransit and community connections is really another example of what we set out as objectives a couple of years ago, to bring down to the more local levels through, let's say, complete streets and such like that, the funding to make our municipalities where we live, and also overall, if we're going to go from town to town, places more accessible. have a more robust and accessible, universally accessible system. So I think this is all going hand in hand.
Thanks, John. And I'll point out a couple of things. In terms of the goal, the projects and goal, a couple of them are MBTA projects, and so it wasn't simply money going to highway projects. But as I said, the one in Somerville is multimodal, and I'm not quite sure to what extent it really creates synergy with the McGrath project. And I kind of asked that question in the meeting, but I didn't ask it particularly well, because what I was really trying to drive at is that now Somerville has like 2 big projects, and I very much support McGrath. I support this one, and I was feeling that we could make an argument to the rest of the region that one of the benefits of focusing that much money in Somerville is just that combining the 2 projects, especially at this point in time, would give us a much bigger benefit than programming one now and another one later on. But what MassDOT made it clear to us is that that superstructure is something that's going to happen right away. And that was one of the challenges that we had, was that we had this money and we really needed to spend it, and so MassDOT was going to do this, but now we've given MassDOT some funding, and as I said, hopefully, it will deploy the funding, the money that it got later on, on projects that maybe we would like to do, but can't do for whatever reasons. Either we just don't have the money at the time, or it is beyond eligibility for what we can spend our monies on. There's something else, but I'll come back to it. Jen Rowe?
I guess a comment and a question. I think, well, first of all, thank you, Matt, for presenting about this, and for this must have done a lot to last minute changes to fill holes and whatnot. So your work and through the finish line. I guess the comment is, and I'll say I wasn't at the most recent IPO meeting. I was just struck that all of the projects that were submitted at that meeting that hadn't already been scored and kind of vetted through the process were all from RTAs or the MBTA or MassDOT. And so I was sort of curious if any municipalities also had projects that they brought up as hey, this is close to 25% design, at 25% design might be able to fit into 22, 23, 24. And if not, is there, I guess, any reflection that we might do in terms of how do we build the capacity of municipalities to have this kind of lineup or deck, I guess, of different projects that are all moving along so that they can fit into plug these holes, and we're not always, as much as worthy as these projects are, we're not always turning to MassDOT and the NBA to fill these.
Yeah. And do you want to say something to that, Matt?
Yeah, I'd be happy to weigh in and just say, Jen, I think it's a really good question, and certainly something that I think at least one, but perhaps a couple of board members raised over the last few weeks is just, municipalities obviously have a number of priorities that aren't always reflected, in the TIP process, just given that, they may be pursuing other avenues for moving a project forward or what have you. And yeah, I think there is a desire at the municipal level to say, when we have these sorts of early to mid-year funding opportunities, is there a chance to sort of take something that may not have been a project pursuing TIP funding and sort of, switch gears a little bit and bring that into the TIP process. And I think, generally, I would say probably most, if not all, MPO members are on board with that idea. And certainly at the staff level, we'd love to support that work. I think the challenge is that it just varies by project, how easy that transition is, because depending on the project, there are a lot of state and federal requirements that, a lot of strings attached to these funds in terms of design standards and timelines and the like. And I think some projects may be able to make that jump relatively easily, while others may have more of a challenge. And so I think, this is probably just a good opportunity for us to reflect more broadly on like how do we create a broader pipeline generally, even sort of regardless of when a project might be ready. But it really is sort of a complex like interplay between, MPO and MassDOT resources and municipal resources to all sort of, keep projects moving forward, even if we don't have like a, funding path for them identified yet. But it's definitely something that I would say all parties are interested in supporting. It's just a matter of like finding the right sort of project to do that work with.
It's really hard to get a community to, set off on planning for a project if there is little guarantee, or let me rephrase that, if there is little commitment to seeing it through, because we, especially with a lot of community engagement, and we try to increase that. If it's simply theoretical, you're really not going to get people to buy into it, and so then it's like, okay, if we're not going to be able to engage the community on this because it's just not real enough, then how do we move that forward with the limited resources that we have in town, which is really staff resources? How do we justify having them spend their time on this versus spending their time on something where we know that there's at least the hope of a commitment, and I should rephrase that, in more than a hope, that you know that you're in a queue to get the funding, and it may take a little while, but if you stay in the queue and you show that your project scores well, and you stay, you keep designing it as you should, you meet these milestones, that you'll get funding. Essentially, you get on the tip. So how do we, tell a community, well, we just want you to have this project ready so that if we have some extra money, then you're there. So what Matt says is it's better if you have a chance to do a switch. It's on a different track, but once again, the requirements can be such that it can be hard to make that switch. Andy?
I'm liking the train metaphor. Just have to say that, Len.
Okay.
So yeah, throwing some switches around for municipalities is probably pretty challenging. Even I could imagine Jan probably knows this too. In Cambridge, we also have challenges if we were trying to stick to kind of not only the federal years being kind of off from our fiscal years and all this kind of stuff. Like there's just so many different ways that gaps form. So just kind of throwing the switch doesn't necessarily mean that a municipality can follow through on it. So definitely agree. I guess a couple of thoughts that I just had to, and I guess maybe this is more just reconfirming some of our conversation that we've had. I think one of the things that might be helpful for us to take a look back at, and I don't know if Matt, maybe you could confirm this for me, is in Cambridge, we've been really concerned about a couple of the projects that were in the 2014 Accelerated Bridge Program not having been able to be fully completed because money ran out, cost overruns on some other projects that were high priority and stuff like that. And I'm wondering if there's maybe some of those previous programs that we should just check against. For Cambridge specifically, it's the River Street Western Ave bridges across the Charles, and their condition being fairly poor. Every time we hear something about bridges from the state, they just don't happen to be on that list. And we know their condition does seem to continue to be deteriorating. I'm wondering if there's other type of resources that we should take a look at just to check ourselves when we see switches like this that kind of, leave our head scratching, at least having a good check to go back against might be helpful for at least this group to have something in our pockets. But Matt, do you know of previous kind of planning or programs like that we should just be aware of, just to make sure that, does this pass the smell test? I think is kind of what I'm trying to say. Are there other resources we should consider?
Yeah, I think it's a really good question. And obviously the sort of list of projects that has been on the radar in the past but not pursued, it's like those projects are sort of scattered across a lot of different sources, I would imagine. So off the top of my head, I don't have like a great answer to this, but it's definitely something that I appreciate that you raised, because it's I think, part of a larger conversation that, you know, I think the MPO is interested in continuing, which is around, you know, what are all the different sorts of ways that we bring projects into this pipeline? And how do we make sure that we are tackling some of these priorities, you know, that may be sort of straddling this municipal and state priority boundary where it's like everyone's interested in doing it, but it's never quite made, you know, the path forward. And so, yeah, so this is something I could probably think a little bit more about and maybe get you a better answer, but I'm really glad that you raised it, because I think it is, it identifies some of the gaps in the process where, you know, obviously the tip tries to catch as many of these projects as possible and bring them into the pipeline, but you know, that work is a little bit challenging given the sort of number of projects that are out there. And so, you know, I think it's a testament to that, you know, we can always do better in making sure that we're hearing those needs so that they're on our radar as well. And then we can be a little bit more proactive in bringing those projects into the conversation when there's a, you know, a space for them.
Yeah, I totally imagine that, you know, there's like almost 1 million different actors that you're trying to keep track of. So it's probably a Herculean task just to keep track of them, let alone bring them through this process. I guess the other quick question that I had is, this is again more the difference between state kind of prerogative and municipal prerogative, but I think there's the longstanding local desire for the Green Line extension to go to Mystic Valley Parkway Route 16. You know, obviously the project is coming in under budget, which is one of the reasons why I think that the additional year of funding was not pursued or zeroed out in this case. Was there any kind of information in the status update that maybe you all could share about that specific Green Line extension project, about kind of the future, you know, one-stop extension? You know, I think not so much in Cambridge, but definitely in Somerville, and some of our electeds in Cambridge are also really keen on that last phase 2 of this Green Line extension being done. Of course, they're throwing out ideas of like Green Line to Porter Square, which haven't even been studied or engineered, but you know, like we'll get to that when we can. But just on this last little bit of the current Green Line extension, I was curious to know if you have any more info.
Yeah, it is a question that came up. I'm trying to remember. I don't think it was on at the March 31st meeting, but it might have been the meeting prior to that, where a board member did raise the question of like, what about phase 2? You know, I think the answer at that time from, you know, our partners at MassDOT was like, there isn't like a tangible update to offer right now. And so, you know, I think right now I don't have any more tangible details to offer, but I do, you know, I think that is like one of those projects that is on everyone's radar, and with new funding hopefully available, not just in this 5-year period, but going forward, you know, I think that's probably on, you know, a lot of different stakeholders lists of a project to hopefully see into the pipeline. Yeah, again, I can definitely do a little bit more digging and probably give you a better answer. But right now I don't have like a ton of concrete details to share.
I have an idea that I'll mention, you know, in a little bit, but we'll go to John McQueen.
Andy, that was great. In terms of, so I've been involved with that ABP program when it was first started, and I guess with the change of administrations, the focus came off, and well, the official initiative fell off, and also Victoria went up to New Hampshire. So there wasn't necessarily the internal management to keep pressing to have that those 2 key bridges rehabilitated. I mean, they were in bad shape back then. You can only imagine another decade how much they've deteriorated. And plus, there was also the questions then about the underpasses that needed to be either resolved or addressed, because they had postponed, or they had built into the, I think in the Lars Anderson, they had built in the movement of the utilities so that it wouldn't preclude having the underpasses. So, I mean, that whole project, boy, it could and should be reborn and surfaced with some priority. Back to another point of Jen's, of what to do with kind of helping municipalities to move things forward from maybe a state where they see they're not funded or things like that, but they can move into a better state of readiness. I think maybe it was at the 3C meeting, we talked about ways perhaps of helping communities or identifying ways to help communities. One was examining what a particular community with a project's bandwidth is with their DPW, having engineers on staff and available to really, on their part, dig into the designs and maybe help move things forward internally. And the other one was looking for other sources of funding. I think we talked about this, Matt, which we were going to investigate whether I think Community Preservation Act funds can be used for planning and some of that, but whether or not some of the Chapter 90 funds could be tapped into by a municipality. I mean, it's all to benefit a municipality, I guess, to move these things forward. And in some cases, the project on a tip that they're pursuing may have a lot of be intertwined, let's say, on a route that might be getting Chapter 90 funding anyway. So it would be helpful perhaps for that kind of synergy to be explored and made available and really proactively, I guess, through MassDOT to really say, here's what we have to help things move forward. You may think you're out there on your own and with just a limited amount of money, but here are little pockets that you can do. And if it's important to you and you have the bandwidth, let's go. Let's really work together. We want this to be a great system. Anyway, I'm done.
Thanks, John. Appreciate it. Fred Mosley.
Yeah, just to follow up with John's questions on Chapter 90. Design funds are actually one of allowable tasks that you can do under Chapter 90. I have several jobs that were actually our design is being funded through Chapter 90. The challenge we have is $200 million a year doesn't even scratch the surface for paving. And the municipalities are very, very protective of that money. I had a project up in Marblehead, and they were really weighing more on paving than trying to pay for design funds. So if we can push the legislation to get us up to $300 or $400 million, that'll work. I know a lot of towns will kick in probably $1 million a year out of the general fund just to supplement Chapter 90 and road projects.
So, but Fred, I guess still how does that address the designing issue if the designing issue is a function of having people on staff to do it?
It's really the way the process is set up right now. You have to have a qualified designer through the pre-qualifications from MassDOT. So it's not really geared for municipalities to actually do the design in-house. And for the most of them, I'll say with the exception of maybe Boston and Cambridge, do not have the resources available to be able to actually develop a design on a project. It takes a lot of effort on kind of a full-time basis. And
Right.
you're really straining municipal resources if they're going to spend time designing.
I see. So then maybe, so I understand now. I'm getting to get a better picture then, and maybe has some makes things more feasible. I mean, so then essentially what you're saying is that municipalities should always just kind of outsource the designing. I mean, so they don't really need to have the staff. I mean, they just hire someone to do the designing for them. And now we just need to provide them with the monies, so that they can afford that designing. That makes it more feasible. I mean, so now it's really just a matter of having them feel that that's a good investment of their money, so that the project will eventually get programmed if it shows its merit. Yes, it shows its merits. Once it does. Okay, thanks for clarifying that. It's probably obvious to everybody else, but I just got it. Go ahead. So you're gonna say something more, Fred?
Nope, that was it.
All right, thank you. Jen?
I attended a webinar, I think Fox hosted it, but it was about the bipartisan infrastructure law, and I believe they had said that there was, like, one of the changes was that at least municipalities, I'm not sure about other entities, could choose to adopt different design guidance. And this, for example, like the city of Boston could choose, we want to go with NACTO's design guidance rather than AASHTO or some other federal manual. And I bring this up because I'm curious. I don't know how that functions funds, because I know when I approached some folks about, hey, there's a lot of funding available. Do we have anything that could be, already at 25% design? We did have some things that were already at 25% design, already had done a ton of community engagement, or pretty much could be slotted in 23, for example. But the feedback was MassDOT requires very different design aspects of the design. They might, this design that we have, they might not approve, even though we actually think our design is more progressive and like keeps people safer and whatnot. And so there seemed to be, I guess, what that begs the question to me, and again, this is someone I haven't gone through having a TIP process, or through the TIP process on behalf of the municipality, but I'm wondering, like, is there some disconnect when municipalities don't want to seek this funding because the design isn't, they don't want that, the design that's required of it, or of MassDOT, and does that make it so that only certain types of projects are funded using regional target funds? So that's just like a broad question, and I was curious if people had thoughts on it.
I think that's directed to Matt. And Jen, I hate to give you a hard time again, but your audio is just so low. It's so there is, it's just, so sorry about that. It's so hard to hear you. So I have my volume almost maxed out. So hold on before you talk, Matt, because you're gonna blow out my ears. So there you go. Thank you.
I'll start quiet, and then I can slowly build up so you can adjust.
Thanks.
Yeah, no, I think it's a really good question. I think that is at a big picture level, like one of these constant themes that comes up, right? Is like, in some ways, like the MassDOT process and MPO funds, or some combination of MassDOT and MPO funds, is really ideal for tackling these projects that are like too big for a municipality to handle the capital costs of alone. But then the flip side of that is that there are, again, like strings attached to the funding. That means you have to sort of go through a certain process, meet certain design requirements. And I think for some projects that's not really an issue, right? Like the project would have been designed to roughly the same sort of design anyways. But yeah, I could see there being some issues around like certain design elements, especially things that are more, like progressive elements, things that are more new and maybe, I don't want to say untested, but perhaps like sort of at the cutting edge of infrastructure design that maybe a municipality would want to pursue, but that don't always align with where federal standards are. And so it is a challenge. I think one of the things that we're all sort of collectively trying to think about is all the changes that came through the bipartisan infrastructure law, like how, just trying to digest everything that's in there, and how do we best leverage those changes, the new funding sources, the new discretionary grants, to really just do the best work that we can for the region. And I know it's something that a lot of municipalities have already come to us and said, like, we're interested in trying to navigate our way through what all this means. And I know our partners at MassDOT are certainly doing that work in an ongoing way right now. And so my hope is that in the coming months, as we continue to roll out the new infrastructure bill, that we will be able to get some more clarity on some of these, less on the funding availability side and more on like the policy change side, to understand like how we can actually leverage those policy changes for different sorts of approaches in the region. Again, maybe not the most tangible answer, but I think the hope is that we will continue to have more tangible answers on that as we all sort of collectively work through, what the next 5 years are going to look like under this new legislation. And so I think to the extent that those questions are coming up at the municipal level, like definitely keep us posted, because our goal is to sort of get all these questions gathered up and then try to address them and approach our work in a way that brings some level of clarity to the new law. And so to that end, I think we are going to be doing some surveying coming up. This is a little bit of a sneak peek, but I do think we're going to be doing some more outreach at the MPO level in the coming months to get a better sense of these sorts of questions and issues that are coming up at the local level around the new infrastructure law. So we can then sort of respond to that in a way that hopefully meets as many of those as we can. So thank you for bringing that nuance to the conversation, and please keep doing that because that helps us identify where opportunities might lie.
So one of the things we discussed, I think it was in our 3C committee meeting, was funding a lot of the small community connections projects. Like there were a couple of bike racks that were like less than $10,000. One might have been less than $5,000. And so what we needed to do though was to make sure that the MPO had the bandwidth to deal with the administrative aspects of coordinating the project, and so we did. So we felt comfortable recommending that the board approved or put these projects in the tip. But the question is, if we want to bring on more of those, Matt, how do you think we would staff up to deal with that?
Yeah, it's a great question. And so, I think specifically with those two bike rack projects, it's a little bit more of a challenge. We didn't quite get into the details on this in the MPO meeting, but it's a little bit more of a challenge because, we've been pursuing this collective purchasing model with MAPC, but because of the sort of inflationary pressures that we're seeing in material costs, that collective purchasing agreement for bike racks is actually currently suspended. I know this is something that a number of municipalities have come to us to ask about in recent months. So this is a pretty recent development that happens sort of midstream for the tip cycle this year, and is really sort of a product of our current COVID-induced inflationary environment. And so those sorts of challenges exist, but the goal with something like the bike rack program is to continue to use something like a collective purchasing model so that we don't have to staff up a ton to manage a bunch of those projects. I think the projects that we saw this year, we had two projects that were under $10,000 each. One was applying for one bike rack shelter, and then one was applying for three like clusters of 6 bike racks. And so those are both very small projects. And I think, to be honest, like those are smaller than we thought we would see. I think when we first structured that program, we anticipated municipalities coming to us being like, we want to book bike racks through our whole town center. We want, 30 bike racks or something. And we didn't quite see that. And so I think some of it is on us at the MPO staff level, working with, MassDOT and our partners at MAPC to sort of scope out that program in a way that finds that sweet spot. So it doesn't take, too much staff time to administer really, really small projects, but we're still allowing municipalities to pursue these somewhat smaller scale projects that can have a meaningful impact in their communities. And so I think we still have a little bit more work to do, but yeah, yeah. Sorry,
you call them nano projects, because they're smaller than micro projects. But I think the communities get a lot of bang for the buck on those. I think the MPO gets a lot of goodwill also, and I think for these projects, I don't think it's a matter of them getting it from the town or from the MPO. If they don't get it from the MPO, they're not going to get it. We certainly won't get it anytime soon. So I like to see us do what we can, to try to support those on the administrative side. So I'm going to stop. I have a little bit more to say, but I see David Montgomery's hand up.
Hi, thanks. This question probably will convey that I don't really understand Chapter 90 thoroughly, but I'm wondering if there might be a role for the MPO structure to help guide more leveraged use of Chapter 90 funds, and by which I mean, I'm aware in our town that there have been multiple annual allocations to sort of pave and redesign block by block downtown areas using sort of complete street approach, using most of the allocation, the Chapter 90 allocation, year by year. The problem with this approach has been that you can only do so much with that limited amount of money that comes to the town, and you end up with you would actually probably save money if you could bite off a bigger chunk. And but the municipalities are eager to, like, it's sort of like, hey, free money coming from the state's system. We know what we're doing with our own monies. We'll allocate this chunk. And it seems like there's a lost opportunity for doing it at a larger scale, getting it at a cheaper overall cost. And I just was wondering if there's a way that, instead of relying on each municipality to sort of wake up and smell the coffee, could it be incentivized at the state level? Like, if you do this kind of grouping of your annual allocation to achieve efficiencies of scale, we'll toss in a little extra in reward for your having done that. I don't know if this is the right forum for that conversation, but some of what you just said a moment ago made me raise that, so just throwing it out.
You mean like an entity that is focused on continuity, cooperation, and completeness? That's that word. No, on being comprehensive. So yeah, entity that's focused on being comprehensive, continuous, and cooperative. Yeah,
yeah, something like that.
Something like that. So no, I mean, I think that's a role for us. Really, David. But you actually want it on the state level. And I think to the extent that we have MassDOT 2 slots on our board, and I honestly feel that that everyone's operating in good faith. And it's really a matter of how do we really execute on doing that. What does it really mean to execute on doing that? How do we actually bring the communities together to do that? Or is it that we go to the communities and do it? Someone said recently, I think it was at a board meeting, that actually it might have been at a UPWP meeting where we are going to try to make certain kinds of projects, the ones where I think they do the corridor projects or another kind of project, just part of the annual cycle. Because one of the goals of those is to kind of show to multiple towns what can be done. So essentially the MPO in doing the study is kind of like doing the preliminary design work, kind of like showing, well, if you do this, this is one way you could do it, and these would be the benefits of doing it. I wish Sandy were here now because he would explain it better than I did. So I kind of responded to what you said, David. I don't think it was an adequate response. So what would you suggest in trying to execute on what you brought up?
I'm not sure I have any great ideas, but the idea occurs to me that allocating some extra amount of funds that is sort of a reward for taking this approach might go a long way. It wouldn't have to be doubling of the funds, but when municipalities might access additional funds for doing sort of, quote, the right thing, they might be more inclined to do that if they get a little more for doing so.
No, I hear you. And actually, if they could get the funding too.
But I honestly don't know how one shepherds that through. I assume through the legislature. I haven't even stopped to think about that yet.
Well, still, I think it's a good issue. One to think about more and figure out what maybe we can advocate for, even if it's not as the council, but at least having us members become more aware of the issue, be able to speak to it intelligently in terms of advocating to our representatives. So John Strauss.
Thanks, Len. Yeah, David has hit the nail right on the head, and that's probably the biggest issue that we face here in Burlington, is the complete siloing of all the different initiatives and money going to all the different little town departments that don't seem to really bring themselves together. And one of the greatest little reminders of that was that a project which was funded through MassDOT and complete streets on Route 3A, which was a Woburn project. And if it was possible just to continue that whole idea up Route 3A, which is a big issue here in Burlington, that would have been great. Would have saved a lot of money, wouldn't have had to plan twice. And it would, that's why I said David has just really come up with something. And then in terms of the transit, there's always the focus on regionalization, which we try here in Burlington to kind of merge with Lexington, but maybe not. And so there's a lot of discussion going back and forth. But again, a little financial incentive sometimes makes a big difference. So thanks again to David for bringing that up. That was fantastic.
So I hear you. So Burlington and Woburn, I would think, would be in the same subregion, right? Of the MPO. And I'm just don't.
I think we are. I'm not 100% on the whole hierarchy of all this, but
Well, so then that's a good point, because I think part of what the MPO tries to do is that it has not tries. It does have these sub-region meetings. Is it quarterly, Matt? And I know it's more than once a year. I'm trying to think it's quarterly, right?
Yeah, so it actually, most of them meet nearly monthly.
Okay.
And MAPC leads that effort, so they have most of the meetings, but then MPO staff will attend, usually like 1 to 2 a year per subregion. And then actually in the inner core, we do meet quarterly, just because there's, tends to be a lot more transportation talk at those meetings.
So that would be a mechanism, for at least hopefully making the MPO aware, of the desire for communities to do things. And even if the communities don't put them together, then I would hope that the MPO staff could go, these two would fit together very nicely. And how do we now try to advocate for both of them? If not at the same time, then sequence them such that it really is continuous. So when was that? This is still to John. So when was that Woburn project done?
It hasn't been started yet. It was just awarded. I would have to look. I'm gonna say it was awarded here, and it just pertained to the intersection of I think it's called Bedford Street and Route 3A, Cambridge.
Right.
And doing improvements, but if they had been able to continue the planning up 3A through the center of Burlington, and then the MassDOT has they have a project going, which I think is just resurfacing further up in Burlington towards Billerica.
Yeah.
Again, it's a little patchwork thing.
Right.
And, coordination would have saved everybody with the big intersection of Wynn Street and 3 up in Burlington. That's a big safety issue. So it would have been great to have everything all sort of planned out at least. And then, construction, whenever. So.
Well, this is like a real case example, and it'd be good to understand why that didn't happen. And then I'd be interested in trying to pursue why that didn't happen. And so let's give some thought to understanding that. And so I'll try and find out what subregion you're in, and then find out who on staff attends those meetings, and get a handle on it. So thanks for bringing that up.
Oh, thank you. I'll try to catch up with you about what happened at our end.
Yeah. All right.
I think there's different agencies and different time spans, and
anyway. Right. And then there might also be the tension, of trying to distribute the funds, and that's why I feel that, if there are projects in a pretty concentrated area, or getting funds, I think we also kind of need to make the argument for why that is synergistic, either with respect to cost savings or the resulting other benefit, like increased transit or increased safety. Why it's better to do them all than to distribute the funds around the region, so that you don't run into equity arguments, so all right, so I'm just going to toss out there that if we get the Green Line to Route 16, it's going to make me even more push for a bus that goes from Alewife to Lexington. And I hear one of the plans or ideas is to run the Silver Line from, is it Chelsea? Yeah, I forget where SL3 is running to, the far north end of it, but run that potentially to Wellington. So could you imagine like a Silver Line extension all the way to Alewife, going to Wellington, and then now 16, to hit the Green Line extension and then over to the Red Line? Heard the idea here first, folks. So with that, I think we kind of touched a lot on 3C, but John McQueen, you want to say anything more about it, or John Stewart?
I think that the whole issue of how we can, let's say, draw into a more unified system of funding through, let's say, combining planning for and within Chapter 90. Maybe, as Fred said, the funds really barely cover all the potholes, but if the legislators can come up with another pot of money that maybe is not just given to the municipality, but can be drawn upon within Chapter 90 to fund more of this systematic planning, like David was talking about, and as John was talking about, that would really help overall in terms of connecting a community or communities.
Great. And I just want to say that I think I was so happy that we got to have this 3C committee early by what we normally do, because normally we don't pull the committee together until after we are presented with the draft tip. And here what we did was we met between the period that the MPO presented the scenarios that it was considering, and when it was going to pick the scenario that would be the basis for the draft tip. And so there's, I think, probably always there's going to be a 2-week gap there. And so we just have to time it so that we have that extra meeting so that we can make input. And at that point now, we're not simply reacting to what the MPO present to us. We're actually making input, and so what we advocated, what we asked for got included. It's probably more a function of the amount of money that was there so than anything else. but at least we got an air, and also, we did advocate, as I said, for having the low cost, high point projects be included. Once again, that may have been more a function of the money available than anything else. But I know that Matt was listening, and I know that whoever replaces Matt will listen, and that's really what we're asking for, is that let us have a voice into the system before the decisions are made, and so we just had to figure out when to do that, because if we simply just waited on our normal monthly schedule, we were never going to get there unless for some reason it lined up with our schedule, and I don't think that was going to happen. So just keep an eye out on that. I'm planning on being around for a while, but there's that point in March where you have that window, and we have to make the space for it. So yeah, I'm happy about that. So that's all I have to say about 3C. Now we get the draft at some point, probably the end of the month. Yeah, and then Andy, I'm sure would have been part of that 3C committee meeting, but he was busy. I don't think he's going to be so busy, for the comments on the draft. So we'll fire it. Oh, I know what had come up, in the discussion was that I'm going to bleed right into new business. So I think we have a good sense of what the draft is going to be, and so if there's a desire, I mean, for the 3C committee to meet before it officially comes out on the 28th, and feel free to do so. We just will need to publicize it because we just want to hear the OML. I think we're a small enough group that we don't have to, but we just want to publicize it so that the public is aware and can participate if they want to. But I just put that out there, so that we can just be a little bit ahead of schedule as opposed to waiting until it comes out and then trying to squeeze in meetings. To John, Andy, and that's J-O-N, John Stewart, John McQueen, and Andy Rieker. If you want to think about that now, we can. If other people on the committee want to be a part of it, then feel free to join. Since we are adhering to OML, we don't have to worry about too many people being on the 3C committee. So I guess rather than leaving this hanging at this point, let's maybe try and make a decision, even if it's a negative decision. Would there be an interest in having a 3C committee either next Wednesday, the 20th, or the following Wednesday, the 27th? Or would you really prefer to wait until after it comes out, which is going to be on the 28th, and then try and do something maybe the first Wednesday in May, so that we could then present something to the full advisory council on that second Wednesday? Yeah.
So if I may just say, because the NPO is going to be discussing this on the 28th, the materials will be posted for that meeting prior to the 27th.
Yeah.
So technically, everything that would be available for review for the NPO would also be available to the advisory committee, or the 3C documents committee rather, by the 27th.
Yeah. So I'm not in a position where I can see everybody since we don't have the screen up, so I'm not seeing what heads are doing. So I just need yeah, no problem. I just need someone to chime in. Either they want to do this or they. So it'll be available by the 27th. So that'd be the earliest we want to do it. Do people want to meet on the 27th? No, I'm seeing no from John Quinn. All right, so then that makes it the first Wednesday in May, and whatever that date is. Okay, all right. So we need to plan that out at this point because we don't have another meeting before then. So the next meeting of the 3C committee will be the first Wednesday in May.
That will be the 4th, May 4th.
Okay, all right. Thank you. So that's done. All right, and so that's about it. And the chair's report was really going to be about that meeting, that marathon meeting that we had in order to come up with the draft. It's a long meeting, but it ended on a good note, and I think it was a very cooperative note with MassDOT. So that's all I have. And I apologize, folks. Matt has a slew of minutes for us. And I wasn't strong enough in advocating for a slot on the agenda for the minutes. But we're gonna do it next month, and we're gonna devote like at least 10 minutes to it because it's gonna be a lot of minutes. At least 6 months, and probably at that point, more. So Matt's been working on it, and we'll do it next time. We'll do it. So that's it for me. So anyone else with any new business? Is John? Let me pull up my participants. And yeah, John Stewart's still here. Franny's not here. Oh yeah, Franny's still here. So I know that we talked a few months ago about RTAC and big ideas. We may be coming back to one of these meetings in 3 to 6 months. So I will circle back to you all maybe in the next couple of weeks to see if either or both of you want a slot on the agenda next month. And I know that we're hoping that we'll hear from Shaleka about the UPWP universe, and so that may very well take a lot of time. And then you'll hear from the 3C committee regarding our letter for the tip. And so if either or both of you want some time on that agenda, let me know. Otherwise, I'll try to circle back to you in a couple of weeks to find out if you want to be on the agenda. All right. So anyone else do business? If you said anything in the chat to me that you want me to hear, please tell me now, because I'm not good at following the chat when I'm sharing. All right. So I'll entertain a motion to adjourn. Did I see a hand up? From John? I mean, from Mr. John Quinn? No? Yes?
I move that we adjourn.
Oh, thank you. I was hoping that's what that was. You know, you got a second for somebody?
A second.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Montgomery. And so with that, folks, we're adjourned. Thank you.